Hey there, viewers. Imagine being the one holding the medical records, the quiet truths, the things no one else was supposed to know. And now you're called to testify. Would you speak up or stay silent? Today, Diddy's prison doctor took the stand, and what he revealed has officially changed everything. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Transfer Request. I remember that morning because of how quiet the hallway was. Usually by 7 a.m., you could hear the muffled thud of boots, doors creaking open, and the constant hum of vending machines flickering under bad fluorescent light. But that day, it was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that sits under your skin before anything even happens. I was barely 3 sips into my coffee when Carol dropped the folder on my desk. She didn't say anything. She just stared at me like she was watching for a reaction. The manila folder looked like every other urgent intake, stamped with red lines and the priority internal only watermark. It wasn't until I flipped it open that I realized it was different. The inmate ID was blacked out at the top. Not unusual, sometimes redacted files made their way around when we were dealing with violent offenders or court-sensitive cases, but the first page wasn't a medical chart. It was a chain of emails. The subject line read, "Request for dedicated clinical observation." The notes were fragmented. A report from a nurse on rotation said the patient hadn't eaten in 5 days. Another mentioned uncontrolled shivering, possible lesions, and paranoid behavior. One of the medical interns had tried to perform a routine blood draw and was reportedly yelled at until the CO pulled her out of the cell. I scanned the timestamps. This was all within the last 10 days. There were no names, just references. The patient, the subject, the profile. It was a clinical distance I'd seen before in paperwork, when someone didn't want accountability. But by the time I reached the final page, the anonymity cracked. Near the bottom, right under the request for outside consultation, I saw it typed in bold. Inmate, Combs, Sean J. I sat back. That explained a lot. Around the facility, the staff had been whispering about the ghost block, a handful of cells that no one ever saw but where the high-profile ones got tucked away. I hadn't thought much of it. MDC handled all sorts. Mob figures, CEOs, washed-up politicians. It was a place built to forget people. But this wasn't standard. I closed the folder and ran my fingers across the edge of the desk. We'd had celebrity types before, but most of them either broke down or got swallowed by the rhythm. No one needed their own doctor. No one got a full transfer request for observation. An hour later, I was in the administrator's office. The door was half open, blinds drawn, and the air smelled like stale paper and something metallic, maybe the heating system again. The woman behind the desk looked exhausted, the kind of tired you only see after 10 years in a place like this. She didn't introduce herself, just pushed another folder my way. "You've read the file." "I have. We need someone on it. I'm not infectious disease." "It's not a request for treatment. It's eyes, ears, quiet monitoring. You'll log everything." "Why not send him to a hospital if it's that serious?" She didn't look at me when she said it, just tapped her finger against the desk. Once, twice. "No hospital." That was it. No explanation, no concern. I knew better than to ask more. "You want me to be a snitch?" "No," she said, finally meeting my eyes. "We want someone with enough medical background to understand what they're seeing, and enough sense to know when not to report it." I was quiet. She must have read the hesitation on my face because she leaned forward slightly. "I saw the file," she said. "You've had complaints before. A review board almost pulled your license over that last site consult, didn't they?" My jaw tightened. She shrugged. "This can help clean that up." "So that was the game?" I nodded, took the folder, and left. The walk down to the infirmary wing was long and silent. The cell blocks were on full lockdown that morning, which meant I didn't see any inmates, just guards posted stiffly by every door, like statues watching you with bored eyes. I tried not to meet anyone's gaze. Everyone in here was either part of the system or crushed under it. No point making friends. When I reached the door marked Restricted Medical D, I paused. There was a keypad lock, one I didn't have the code for. I knocked. A guard opened the door after a beat and motioned me in without a word. Inside, the room was smaller than I expected. Sterile, beige. A cot pushed against one wall, a table in the corner. A sealed food tray sat untouched on the floor. And there he was, Sean Combs, sitting upright, his knees pulled to his chest, shirtless, thinner than I remembered from the tabloids, face sunken, eyes darting around the room like he was chasing ghosts. His hair was grayer than I'd thought it'd be. I introduced myself, but he didn't speak, just stared through me. There were red marks around his arms, pressure lines from how tightly he was holding himself. And then I saw the lesion, small, purplish, near the base of his neck, under the collarbone. I kept my voice calm, clinical. "Have you been eating?" No answer. I glanced at the untouched tray. "Do you believe the food is unsafe?" Still nothing. I took a deep breath. "Have you been experiencing symptoms you'd like to talk about?" That's when he looked at me. "I'm not sick," he said, but his voice cracked on the last word. I nodded, scribbled something on my pad. "Okay. They want you to say I am. That's why you're here." I said nothing. He leaned closer, eyes wide now. "They poisoned her, and now they think I did it. But I didn't know, I swear I didn't know." His breathing was sharp. "I'm going to run some blood work," I told him. "Just basic panels." He flinched. "No needles." I didn't push. Instead, I documented everything. His pulse, respiration, blood pressure. The numbers weren't normal, but nothing that would set off alarms unless you were looking for patterns. That's what this was now. Looking for things people didn't want seen. When I got back to my office, I opened a blank file on my encrypted drive. Not MDC's system, mine. I wasn't about to trust their internal database with this. I started entering notes. Patient appears undernourished, visible weight loss, signs of paranoia, possible lesions consistent with immune suppression, denies food due to perceived poisoning, no vitals on file from past week, request for lab access pending. Then I opened the official logbook MDC had given me. It was only 3 pages long. Page 1, patient received, no complications. Page 2, blank. Page 3, entirely blacked out, redacted, the kind of redaction where they don't even leave the headers. It didn't make sense. There should have been daily notes, even if nothing changed, at the very least vitals, dates, any record of observation. But there was nothing. Someone had erased the story before I could even begin writing it. And for the first time in a long time, I felt afraid, not for him. For me. Chapter 2, Baseline. The room didn't change between that first visit and the next morning. Same pale lighting that buzzed faintly above the cot, same tray of untouched food placed exactly where the last one had been. Only now the corner of it was starting to curl, moisture leaking from the cold eggs onto the waxy cardboard base. I stood in the doorway for a few seconds longer than I should have, clipboard in hand, waiting for something, anything, to shift in the space. But he didn't move. Sean Combs was sitting on the edge of the cot, elbows on knees, eyes low. His breath came slow, too slow, like he was measuring every inhale against the silence. The guards posted outside gave me the same nod they always did, a mechanical flick of acknowledgement that felt like someone flipping a light switch off and on. Then I stepped in. This wasn't supposed to be a treatment protocol. They'd been clear about that. I was here to observe, to chart, to document, but only what they needed. Anything more than that was at my own discretion. Or risk. I'd been doing this long enough to know how much to pretend I didn't see. But pretending had limits. I had them once, anyway. "Morning," I said, flat but professional. I moved across the room and set the clipboard on the metal tray table bolted to the wall. "How are you feeling today?" Combs looked up, just a flick of his eyes. The whites were bloodshot, and his skin had a gray tint that hadn't been there the day before. The shadows under his eyes looked carved in. He didn't answer. "I'd like to take your temperature," I added. "No needles." Still nothing. I walked over, made sure he could see the digital thermometer in my palm, and leaned in. He didn't flinch, but his eyes followed my every move, suspicious and sharp, like he was waiting for me to make a mistake. The thermometer beeped. Slight fever, 100.9%. I noted it down without comment. "You mentioned not eating because you think the food's been tampered with," I said, keeping my voice neutral. He stared at the floor. "I'm putting in a request for sealed nutritional packs," I told him. "High-calorie, medically issued. They come directly from our supplier. No prep staff involved." That got his attention. His eyes narrowed. "Why?" he asked. "To stabilize you. You're showing signs of protein deficiency. It's affecting your cognition, reflexes, even your posture." He was quiet again, but I could tell he was weighing it. Weighing me. It was like he didn't trust the air itself in that room. And maybe, in his mind, he was right. I went back to the clipboard and jotted more notes. Patient appears slightly febrile. Continues to report food contamination. No oral intake recorded in over 96 hours. Posture exhibits muscular atrophy in shoulders and lower spine. Recommend CBC T-cell LFT panel under private requisition. It was that last part that lingered in my mind as I wrote it. I wasn't supposed to requisition labs without full clearance from the warden's medical liaison, but I'd learned how to bypass that over the years. If I logged it in the primary system, it would be flagged. If I logged it in the internal comms channel under the night shift nurse's account, no one would question it. Just another test buried under a mountain of useless paperwork. I slid open my portable med case and took out a sterile swab and a blood spot card. No syringes, just a finger prick. It was easier to convince patients that way. "This is just for a general panel," I said, holding up the lancet. "You don't have to say yes. You'll just do it anyway, right?" "No," I told him. "I don't work like that." He hesitated. Then slowly, he extended his right hand. His skin was dry, palm lines deep and cracked. I sterilized the fingertip, pressed the lancet, and collected the blood on the filter paper. He didn't flinch. "You don't have to tell me what it's for," he said, voice low. "I already know." "Know what?" He laughed, a brittle sound, like paper tearing. "You think I don't see how they look at me?" I didn't respond. I sealed the sample, double-bagged it, and slipped it into the hidden compartment under my clipboard. My personal logbook was waiting for me back in the office. Not the official one, the one I was keeping for myself. After I left the cell, I signed the daily observation log at the station, making it all look routine. 10 minutes later, I was back in my office, door locked, lights dimmed. I pulled out the blood sample and dropped it into a BioShield envelope marked for off-site courier. The address I used wasn't on any of MDC's directories. It belonged to a friend at an independent pathology lab upstate who owed me more than a few favors. That done, I opened the personal log on my drive and began typing. Patient exhibits deteriorating physical condition. Visible weight loss exceeding 15% in estimated 3-week period. Prominent scapula and clavicle. Angular features consistent with malnourishment. Psychological state remains impaired. Possible paranoia. Generalized anxiety. Elements of hypervigilance. I hesitated, then I added the next part. One visible Kaposi-like lesion observed on anterior thorax, roughly 1.1 cm diameter, purple-black coloration, no bleeding, no secondary infection noted. Patient refused further examination. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the screen. Kaposi's wasn't something you saw often anymore, not unless it was late stage, not unless someone had slipped through every net the system was supposed to have, and not in someone who'd had access to every doctor in the country when he was free. I didn't want to make assumptions, but the signs were stacking. Refusal to eat, paranoia, lesions, immunosuppression, the white blood cell counts, once they came back, would tell me more, but even without them, I could feel it in my gut. I'd seen this progression before, years ago, in patients who'd been too afraid or too ashamed to get help until it was too late. Someone had missed it, or someone had hidden it. Later that night, I went back to his cell. It was after final lights out, the halls dimmed to orange by the emergency strips that ran the length of the corridor. The guards on rotation didn't stop me. I tapped on the window once before opening the door. He was lying down, not asleep, just staring up at the ceiling like he'd been doing it for hours. I didn't bring equipment this time, just myself. I put the request through. I said, nutritional packs should be here by tomorrow. If it helps, they'll be sealed. He turned his head slowly toward me. I can't eat if I don't know what's in it, he whispered. There's a chain of custody, I said. They come directly from the supplier, triple vacuum sealed. No contact with staff. He looked at me like he wanted to believe that. Then his face changed, softened for just a second. His eyes looked watery, and I saw the way his lips trembled before he spoke again. What did they tell you I have? I froze. He was crying now, not loud, not like a sob, but silently, his chest rising in these small, sharp stutters like he was trying to hold it in but couldn't anymore. What did they tell you? He asked again, voice cracking. No one told me anything, I said quietly. I'm here because there are gaps in the file. I'm here to see what's real. He nodded slowly, still crying. Not for me, for himself. Maybe for someone else I didn't know. And that's when I knew he wasn't just afraid of dying. He was afraid of something being revealed before he could control it. When I got back to my office, the official logbook was sitting on my desk. Someone had returned it while I was gone. I opened it, flipped to the last page, and that's when I saw it. A transfer order. Dated 3 weeks ago, signed by someone high up the chain. A recommendation that Combs be moved to an undisclosed medical unit outside the state for long-term infectious observation. But it had never been executed. No stamp, no follow-up, no explanation. I stared at it for a long time, the paper cold and thin in my hands. Someone had decided to keep him here, not to help him. To watch what happened when they didn't. Chapter 3, The Off-Record File. I wasn't supposed to be working that night. That's the part that stuck with me most. The way everything that followed seemed to hinge on that single scheduling switch. I'd picked up the extra shift for the overtime, thinking it would be a quiet night. Fridays usually were, unless there was a fight or someone started puking from bad commissary junk. But the moment I stepped onto the floor and saw that tight little huddle of suits outside Infirmary D, I knew I wasn't walking into normal. The air was thick with ammonia and something else, something iron-like that clung to the inside of your nostrils. I remember the way the hallway lights flickered behind the men as they stood shoulder to shoulder, not talking, just watching the door. None of them wore correctional uniforms. They weren't from here. Their coats were slim and dark and tailored, and one of them had a small lapel pin I didn't recognize. No name tags, no greetings, just blank stares as I approached the nurse's station. Marissa was there before me, pale and wide-eyed like she'd seen a ghost. She didn't say anything at first, just handed me the emergency bag and pointed toward the room. "They want you to go in," she whispered. "Now." I asked who they were, and she just shook her head. When I entered the room, the light hit me first. It was too bright, buzzing overhead with that high-frequency whine you only hear in medical fluorescence. And then the smell hit, vomit and blood, mixed with something acrid like bile left to ferment. I swallowed hard and moved toward the cot. He was there, curled up on the tile floor, his body trembling like he'd just come out of a seizure. His mouth was wet with blood, slick and deep red, and there were spatters across the floor where it had splashed from his convulsions. The vomit was still warm, pooling beneath him in a sickly trail. John Combs, that was the first time I saw him up close. I dropped to one knee, careful to avoid the fluids, and reached for his wrist. Weak pulse, but it was there. His skin felt clammy, the kind of slick that comes from internal chaos. He mumbled something, too soft to make out, his eyes rolling back slightly. I called out to Marissa to get the vitals kit, but she didn't answer. When I glanced back, I saw her standing just outside the room, her body half turned away, like she didn't want to be seen there at all. I started checking his airway, tilting his head, and that's when one of the suits stepped inside. He didn't introduce himself, didn't offer help. He just crouched beside me, looked at Combs and said, "Get what you need and don't log anything. Bag everything and leave it by the door." He handed me a biohazard bag. It was red, thick, reinforced, not the ones we usually used. I looked up at him, confused. "You want me to collect his clothes, his samples?" "Everything," he said. "Anything with blood, anything he touched. Do not submit this to MDC logs." That went against every protocol we had. I stared at Combs for a second longer, then nodded. I didn't know what else to do. When a man in a federal suit tells you to pretend you didn't see something, you don't argue. Not in a place like this. I stabilized Combs best I could, cleaned what I could clean without disturbing evidence, or whatever they thought it was, and helped get him back on the cot. He was semi-lucid by then, whispering to himself, over and over again. "They gave it to me. I didn't ask for it. I didn't know." I wrote that line on the back of my glove in pen before I forgot it. I kept that glove for weeks, folded in the back of my locker. I don't know why. By the time I exited the room, the red bag was sealed and sitting outside like a cursed object. The suit who gave it to me picked it up without a word and walked off. No chain of custody, no paperwork. That was the end of it. Or so I thought. But the next morning, when I came in for handover, I checked the medical incident log out of curiosity. There was no entry. Nothing from the night before. No vitals, no emergency page, no cleaning requisition, no nurse signature. Like it hadn't happened at all. When I asked Marissa about it, she told me flat out to stop asking questions. Her voice cracked a little when she said it, like she was more scared than annoyed. Then the whispers started, quiet at first, during smoke breaks in the parking garage, in the back corner of the staff cafeteria. "They say he's got something that can't go public, something they can't cure. They moved him once already. No, they tried. The transfer never went through. One of the older COs swore he'd seen Combs being wheeled out in a covered gurney 2 weeks before, but then saw him again the next day like nothing had happened. Another nurse claimed she'd been asked to adjust discharge paperwork from a hospital visit under a different name. A Jane Doe, even though it was clearly him. No one wanted to touch it. Too many red flags. Too many closed-door meetings. Then came the story about the clinic visit. I wasn't there, but everyone heard about it. Late-night transport, 0 lights, straight to Brooklyn Hospital. No markings, no MDC escort vehicles, just a single van and 2 officers in plain clothes. The staff said he was registered under the name Miles Kendrick. The procedure was listed as an MRI for knee inflammation. Standard, right? But there was a nurse who said she saw the readouts. Full-body imaging, not just a knee. Lymph node scanning. Abdominal checks. Even looked like they scanned the neck and jawline. Areas you don't touch unless you're checking for systemic spread. Whatever it was, they were looking for something deeper. And then there was Rosa. Rosa was one of our night shift nurses who'd been working med intake for nearly 5 years. Hard as nails, the kind of person who didn't flinch at blood, screaming, or spit. She came in one Monday morning, pale and quiet. By Thursday, she was gone, just up and quit. Said she was being pressured to backdate files, to make it look like Combs had been receiving daily vitals and psychological evaluations when he hadn't. She left a note behind. I saw it once, briefly, when Marissa showed it to me in the parking lot. It said, "If he dies, they want it to look like it was natural, but there's nothing natural about what's happening in that cell." After Rosa quit, her access badge was deactivated immediately, her name wiped from the staff schedule for the rest of the quarter. It was like they were erasing anyone who got too close to the wrong details. I started having trouble sleeping, nightmares mostly. That red bag, the smell of the room, the look on his face. I wasn't scared of him, I was scared of the silence that followed. Because silence in a place like this doesn't mean safety. It means someone's made a decision. There was one more thing. A week later during rounds, I passed by the admin corridor near records. A door was slightly ajar. I saw a woman I didn't recognize handing a sealed envelope to one of the federal suits I'd seen that night. She glanced over her shoulder, and for half a second, our eyes met. She didn't blink. She didn't nod. The envelope had a stamp on it. Internal Infectious Review, Level 4 Clearance. I never saw her again. Sometimes, when things go quiet late at night and the lights hum just right, I think about that moment, about everything I saw, everything I wasn't allowed to write down. And when I think about what I'd say if anyone ever asked me officially, I know it wouldn't matter, no one's asking. But if they did, if anyone really cared, I'd say this: he's not just sick, or scared, and not scared for him. Scared of what it means if the public ever finds out why. Chapter 4. The Father. The bench outside the courtroom was cold, not from the air, but from the silence that wrapped around it, the kind that settles into concrete and doesn't leave. I'd been sitting there for 40 minutes before anyone said my name. Not out loud, just quietly, a whisper from the clerk, her eyes barely meeting mine when she passed. She told me I could wait inside, but I shook my head. I wasn't ready. Hell, I'd never be ready. Not for this. People call me Mr. C now. Just that. I guess somewhere along the line my name became something too difficult to carry. Or maybe it's easier for them to forget it that way. Names humanize, and they don't want that. Not here. My daughter's name was Sienna. That's a name I'll never let them bury. She was 19 the last time she stood in my living room before everything went black. I remember the look in her eyes more than anything. The way they wouldn't focus. The way they trembled, like they were trying not to fill with tears. Her lipstick was smeared. Her shirt was torn at the shoulder. She had blood on her thigh. It wasn't hers. She wouldn't tell me what happened at first. Just kept saying it was supposed to be safe. They said it'd be fine. I kept asking her who they were, and all she would say was, "The house in the hills, the one with the lights." I knew what she meant. Everyone knew. It was the house everyone whispered about, the place where the music industry blurred with something darker, the place where people got invited once and never came back the same. It wasn't a secret, not really. Just something you didn't say too loud if you wanted to keep your job or your life in one piece. I begged her to go to the police. We sat in the kitchen, the linoleum cold under her bare feet, and I kept my voice as calm as I could, but inside I was burning. "They can help you," I told her. "We can file a report, get a rape kit, a lawyer, anything." She shook her head so hard it looked like it hurt. "They already paid me," she said, voice cracking. That was when I knew I'd already lost her. She didn't say how much, just that someone from his camp showed up the next day, handed her a phone, told her what to say, and then wired the money. She never told me what she had to say, but I saw the video weeks later. Some clip buried in a forgotten blog post where she said everything had been a misunderstanding and that she was embarrassed by the drama. It didn't sound like her. I tried to reach her after that, but she was gone, changed her number, moved out of her apartment, no address, no friends answering calls. I found out later she was flown overseas for modeling work, but no agency ever listed her name. 3 years passed, no contact. Then she showed up at my door at 2 a.m. on a Thursday, hair limp, eyes sunken, skin pale like paper. She'd lost at least 30 pounds. Her hands trembled. She couldn't keep food down. She barely spoke for the first 20 minutes, just cried in the corner of my old leather armchair, the one she used to read in when she was little. Eventually, she handed me an envelope. Inside were 2 folded pieces of paper. Lab results, I think, though half the writing was in medical shorthand I couldn't understand. There were highlighted sections, though, markers. Something about T cells, something about viral load. One of the papers was dated a year earlier, the other was 2 months ago. She whispered, "They said it might stay quiet if I don't talk to anyone. But I think they knew I'd tell you." I asked what it was, what she had. She just looked at me and said, "They won't name it, they just call it complications. But I know, it's eating me." 6 months later, she died. The coroner's report listed complications due to an autoimmune syndrome, but it didn't say more, no specifics. I wasn't allowed to see the full autopsy. They said it was sealed, medical privacy. Privacy from who? I was her father. I hired a lawyer. He said we could open a case, wrongful death, negligence, maybe even homicide if we could prove causality. But then, just as quickly, he dropped me. Said something about pressure from above. No one else would take the case after that. I wrote letters, made calls, got a few return emails that looked like auto-responses. Then the silence started. No one answered anymore. No one wanted to touch it. So I stopped trying. Until a week ago. A woman showed up at my job, an investigator, she said. Government affiliated, though she didn't flash a badge. She just asked me if I still had the lab results my daughter gave me. I told her I did. She said there was a trial, something bigger than anyone had expected, something that involved more than just my daughter, more than any one girl. She didn't use his name, but she didn't have to. She asked me to testify. I thought they'd want me to talk about the party, the blood, the bribe, but no, that wasn't what they needed. They didn't care about the abuse. They wanted to talk about the disease, specifically about how long she'd been sick. They wanted to know if anyone else had seen those results, if she'd said anything about how she got it, if she'd mentioned names. That's what made my stomach turn. They weren't trying to catch a predator. They were trying to trace a virus. So here I am, sitting on this bench, my palms sweating, my heart punching through my ribs like it wants out. The courtroom is just a few feet away, but it might as well be another planet. I don't want to walk in there and say the things I remember. I don't want to see his face again. But I hope for her. The hallway door opens and a man steps out. I recognize him from the news blurbs, though they never say much, just that he's a prison doctor, part of the medical observation team from MDC. They don't give his name, just his title. He sees me sitting there and pauses. Nods once. There's something in his eyes that tells me he knows. Maybe not everything, but enough. Maybe he's seen other girls like her. Maybe he's seen worse. He doesn't say a word, neither do I. We just sit there, 2 men pulled into something neither of us asked for. The hallway is quiet again. I can hear my own breath. I reach into my pocket and pull out the folded lab report. The paper's creased, worn thin from how many times I've opened it. I read it again, even though I've memorized every line, every number, every bracketed note. At the bottom, in her handwriting, there's a single sentence scrawled in blue ink. If they ever ask, tell them I wasn't the only one. Chapter 5. The Breakdown. It started slow, like most things in prison do, the kind of unraveling you don't notice until it's already halfway done. I'd been assigned to Combs's block on overnight rotation for about 3 weeks when things started shifting. Small things at first. He stopped sleeping. That wasn't unusual. Guys with long sentences or high-profile cases, they don't sleep much. The noise gets in their heads, the silence too, but this wasn't that. This was something else. He didn't just toss and turn. He stared all night, at the corners of the room, the vent, the water spout, like something was watching him from the inside. The first night I actually noticed it, he was sitting on the floor, knees tucked to his chest, whispering. I thought maybe he had a radio or some smuggled device, so I came in with the keys and flashlight, thinking I'd catch him. But he wasn't holding anything, just talking low, like he was answering someone invisible. I asked who he was speaking to, and he jerked his head toward the wall and said, "They're still here." I radioed it in, logged it like protocol says. Mental deterioration, paranoia, possible psych break. The medical wing sent down a response note, but no one followed up in person. Said they'd reassess next week. I knew what that meant. No one wanted to touch him. No one wanted to be near him too long. He was toxic in more ways than one. By the end of the second week, he stopped eating completely, unless the food came vacuum sealed in front of him, which we didn't do for anyone else. The nurses called it a waste of resources, but the administration approved it anyway. We weren't told why, just that he had specific dietary precautions. So we brought the packs down, sealed, labeled, sterile. He'd inspect each tray like it was a bomb. Turn it over, sniff the corners, hold it up to the light. I once saw him tap one against the wall 3 times before opening it, like he was testing its weight. Then he poured the contents onto a paper towel and picked through it with the tip of a pen, looking for needles or glass or something microscopic. He started talking to the water too. Wouldn't drink unless he saw the bottle come from a box, said the pipes were tainted, that the walls were lined with something. He peeled back the paint in 3 corners of the cell until the concrete underneath showed, and then he started scratching symbols into it with his fingernails. It got worse after that. We found writing on the walls, at first in pen ink, then in something thicker, darker. I don't like saying it, but we all knew what it was. Blood and feces, smeared across the concrete like crude graffiti. None of the names made sense. Some were just letters, symbols, half-spelled curses. One wall said, "They knew." She bled in the room. Another had a list of initials, circled and crossed out over and over again. We cleaned it quietly, didn't log it. Too much paperwork, too many questions we didn't want answers to. Twice, surveillance footage went missing. Not corrupted, gone. The backup drives for Block D are manually rotated every 24 hours. The guy on camera duty, Reggie, said the feed just cut out between 2:14 and 2:31 a.m. Both times it was the same stretch. The lights in his cell flickered during both gaps. I know because I was on rotation one of those nights. I remember watching the glow shift under the door, like a strobe light going off. I asked Reggie if we should report it, and he told me flat out, if you want to get transferred to janitorial, go ahead. That was how we handled things back there. Keep it quiet, keep your job. But the worst came during that last week. I was doing a walkthrough at around 3 in the morning. Everyone else on the block was asleep, or at least pretending, but when I reached his cell, he was pacing. Slow, steady, counting steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. Every 4th step, he'd stop, touch the corner of the bed frame, then continue. It was like a ritual. I leaned against the door to watch. Sometimes the inmates settle into weird habits, ways of coping, but this wasn't habit. This was panic, disguised as structure. He stopped abruptly, turned toward the wall, and muttered, "I didn't know she had it. I didn't know it could pass like that." I heard it clear as day. I stepped back, hands tightening around my baton, not because I thought he'd do something, but because something in that voice told me he was unraveling fast. And when guys like that break, they either shut down or explode. 2 days later, we had an emergency transfer from Block F, inmate name sealed. They brought him to D-Wing, straight into medical hold, no explanation. Within 12 hours, he was gone again, moved out under security escort. We weren't told why. I knew the guy, loosely. Big man, used to trade snacks for clean socks, quiet type. Apparently he developed a cough so bad it ruptured something in his chest. They said he was throwing up blood by the time they came for him. After he left, I found the note tucked into the slot of Combs' cell door, just a torn scrap of napkin. It said, "Tell the doctor what he saw." I didn't show anyone, just folded it, slipped it in my pocket, and threw it away on my way home. Some things you don't bring into work. By the end of that week, Combs asked for a hazmat cell. Not even sure how he knew we had one. He made the request in writing, said he needed to be isolated from the infected airflow, said the vents were contaminated, said the bedding had blood on it, that the nurse who visited him last left a needle under the pillow. We searched it top to bottom. Nothing. I called it in anyway. Admin sent back a single line, request denied, existing accommodations deemed sufficient. He didn't take it well. He started tearing up the mattress, tossing foam strips around the room, smashing the metal toilet lid against the wall. It took 4 of us to calm him down. We didn't put hands on him. Too much risk. We just let him burn out, let the madness ride itself out of his system until he collapsed. That was the night he coughed blood. I was standing by the med desk when I heard it, this deep, wet sound like something tearing from the inside. By the time I opened his cell, he was on the floor, arms shaking, mouth open, red spilling out onto his jumpsuit in thick spurts. There was a purple mark near the top of his thigh. Small, dark, ugly. It looked like a bruise at first, but too round, too defined. I'd seen enough to know what it was. We got the nurse in. She didn't speak, just knelt down, pressed his chest, took his pulse, and shook her head. He was still breathing, shallow but steady, but the look in his eyes. He looked at me like I was the last person left on earth, like he knew the truth had finally caught up with him, and there was no one left to blame it on. They moved him to a cleaner cell after that. Not the hazmat wing, just one of the back units. They said it was for observation, but we all knew the truth. They just wanted him somewhere quiet, somewhere the bleeding wouldn't stain the rest of the story. Chapter 6. The Internal Memo. The folder arrived on a Thursday, midnight afternoon, just after the cafeteria shut down and before the offices got too quiet to pretend the air wasn't thick with everything no one wanted to say out loud. It was slid across the table like a bribe in a movie, silent, no ceremony, just a dark green binder with a broken clasp and a red sticker across the top corner that said, "Sealed, internal review only." It wasn't even addressed to me. I was only 2 years into my job with the District Attorney's Special Investigations Unit. Technically, I wasn't even supposed to be in the room during evidence review, but the lead was out sick and someone needed to start sorting the backlog. I opened the binder because it was on my desk, and because, in this building, saying no was a quicker way to disappear than saying yes. The first thing I saw was the intake memo. Not a police report, not a court document, a memo. Typed in Courier, single-spaced, full names redacted, just the initials SC at the top, and the inmate number that had been cycling through the office rumor mill for months now. Combs. I'd heard about the case before it ever hit the docket. Everyone had. A mix of celebrity scandal and sealed warrants, of hush money trails and whispered accusations. But that file wasn't about fame. It was about biology, about containment, about silence. There were medical charts, scans, blood panels with missing pages, a flagged note in handwriting I didn't recognize, lesions noted, possible immunodeficiency, no official diagnosis authorized, another sticky note with a half-faded pen line, observation only, no intervention. Then came the internal MDC incident reports, buried behind a wall of coded language. Patient non-compliant. Patient experiencing psychosomatic distress. Patient alleges food tampering and unauthorized physical contact from staff. And then a name. Dr. W. Not a full name, just a signature block on an unsigned log. The reports started taking shape then. Bits and pieces became a pattern. Pages that weren't meant to be together had been compiled in haste, probably by someone who wanted it to be found but couldn't say it aloud. There were timelines that didn't match, tests that were requisitioned but never processed. And then, the transcripts. 2 of them. The first was short, a nurse's statement, logged at 3:17 a.m. during an overnight shift. She described an incident involving Combs collapsing in his cell, bleeding, vomiting, and hallucinating. The response team was not MDC Medical. Instead, 3 men in plain clothes took over the scene and removed all physical evidence, including bedding and clothing. No official incident report was ever filed. The nurse resigned the following week. The second transcript was longer. This one stopped my breath. It came from a now-dead inmate, an anonymous source who had submitted the statement through a legal aid program. The confession was chaotic, barely coherent in some places, but the words were clear enough. He described a room, a back room in a private residence. He talked about being invited to parties where people signed NDAs and were told their phones would be destroyed if found. He said that at one of these gatherings, he witnessed acts he couldn't forget. Unprotected sex, intravenous drug use, something he referred to only as the ceremony. He wrote that Combs had brought people in, some paid, some threatened, some just curious. He described the way one woman had collapsed afterward, bleeding and shaking, and how she'd been carried out wrapped in a towel. He didn't know her name, he just kept calling her the girl with the stars on her back. The part that caught me hardest was toward the end. He wrote, "We didn't know it was real. He said it was just for the night, that we'd be fine, that it was part of the scene. But a few weeks later, one of the guys started coughing up blood. Then another. Then me. Then he added one final line. He said it was a gift, that it would bind us." The inmate died 2 months after submitting the statement. Official cause of death was listed as respiratory failure due to chronic illness. No autopsy was performed. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the file pressing into my stomach like a boulder. I closed the binder, then opened it again, needing to be sure I hadn't imagined it. Everything was real. Everything in that folder, every diagram, every redacted note, every blurred photograph of lesions and test results and intake logs was real, and we were sitting on it like it was a minor misconduct case. Dr. W's name came up again in the last few pages, a report he'd tried to submit through unofficial channels detailing his observations of the inmate's immune system collapse, psychological deterioration, and evidence of secondary infections. He included a warning, brief, clinical, but unmistakable. Exposure risk to nearby inmates not currently accounted for in MDC protocols. Suggest immediate isolation and full-spectrum testing. No one followed up. That same report had a stamp across the top. Do not file, hold for review. I knew what that meant. Someone higher up was deciding whether or not the truth was more dangerous than the lie. I printed one page, just one. Dr. W's summary. I took it into the war room where the senior prosecutors sat behind laptops and coffee cups, planning the next steps in the case. They were arguing over whether to pursue federal conspiracy charges or focus on trafficking. No one mentioned infection. No one mentioned public health. I asked the question carefully, like I didn't know what I was really asking. What's our position on introducing medical evidence? One of the leads looked up. For what? Sympathy? He's not sick, he's manipulative. I told them about the sealed report, about the observation orders, about the missed transfer. I told them what Dr. W had seen. Another prosecutor, older, leaned back in his chair and said, "You want to open that box, you better be ready to answer for every other person in that prison." That was the moment it clicked. They weren't afraid of Diddy's crimes anymore. That part was easy. They had testimonies, recordings, financial trails, survivors who'd lost their fear. What scared them was the other thing. The unseen, the unspoken, the possibility that he hadn't just hurt people emotionally or physically, but biologically, that he'd passed something on, that it was spreading. If we introduced Dr. W, we introduced the idea of exposure vectors, of viral transmission, of something that made this not just a criminal case, but a containment failure. It would change the story from celebrity downfall to federal liability. I was silent for a long time as they debated. Names were thrown out, scenarios proposed. Could we seal the courtroom? Could we redact the transcript? Could we prep Dr. W for a narrow deposition? They talked around it for an hour. Then I went back to my desk, opened a blank subpoena form, typed one sentence. "Do you wrong testify under sealed conditions?" I printed it, signed it, and slid it into the outbound file tray before anyone could stop me. Chapter 7. The Testimony. There were no cameras in the room, no lights, no reporters seated behind velvet ropes with notebooks and microphones, or news tickers flashing dramatic headlines. The courtroom that morning was carved in silence, heavy with the kind of weight you couldn't see but could feel in your chest, like a hand pressing down. What little buzz there was in the air came not from media frenzy or flashing bulbs, but from the few bodies scattered across the back row. Shadowed figures in dark coats, faces unreadable, their presence saying more than their words ever would. They weren't here to observe, they were here to ensure nothing slipped out. On his way, DRW sat alone at the witness stand, his posture rigid but not defiant. There was no grand entrance, no whispered gasps when he walked in, just the slow scrape of his chair as he sat, adjusted his collar, and rested his hands on the edge of the wood, one overlapping the other. Before him lay a small stack of folders, a plastic evidence case, and a plain manila envelope sealed with a red stamp. Confidential, medical privilege. The judge was seated, her expression unreadable, half obscured behind slim glasses and a towering stack of files. She glanced toward the gallery once, then turned her eyes to the man seated before her and gave a slight nod. The court recorder adjusted her headphones. A bailiff closed the side doors softly, muting the hallway. Dr. W was sworn in with no ceremony. His voice, when he repeated the oath, was even, clinical, like everything else about him. The prosecutor stepped forward, not the senior one, but the assistant, who had typed the subpoena with shaking hands and placed it into the outbox before thinking too long about the consequences. He didn't clear his throat or adjust his tie like someone trying to control a room. He simply placed a single sheet of paper onto the podium and began. "Doctor, please state your name and occupation for the record." The answer was given plainly, no embellishment. Just his name, followed by, "I am a licensed physician currently employed as a medical evaluator at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. Prior to that, I served as a general practitioner and clinical observer in various federal detention facilities." The prosecutor nodded. "You were assigned to observe inmate Sean Combs, is that correct?" "I was." "Under what directive?" "I was instructed to conduct daily visual and physical observation of the subject's health status, with a focus on documenting behavioral anomalies, dietary patterns, and physiological deterioration. I was not granted clearance for treatment or intervention." That distinction hovered in the air like smoke. The prosecutor moved closer to the stand. "Doctor, can you describe the first irregularities you observed in the subject?" Dr. W glanced down at his notes, but only briefly. He didn't need them. Inmate Combs displayed advanced symptoms of physiological decline inconsistent with his intake records. These included visible muscle atrophy, skin discoloration, and chronic fatigue. He exhibited signs of extreme paranoia, refusing institutional food and water unless personally sealed and verified. He reported hallucinations and claimed contamination of his cell through the ventilation system. Were there visible physical markers? Yes. The patient had at least 3 confirmed lesions, one on the anterior neck, another near the inner thigh, and a third along the lower lumbar region. These lesions were non-traumatic in origin, purple to black in color, with no signs of abrasion. They were consistent with Kaposi-like sarcoma lesions typically seen in immunocompromised individuals. There was a murmur from the rear gallery, a brief movement, someone uncrossing their arms. "Did you order lab testing?" "I did, initially through standard MDC protocol and then through an independent channel after the original requisition was denied." "You were denied lab testing for an inmate under medical observation?" "Yes." "On what grounds?" "No grounds were provided. The response was simply marked as pending administrative review and then later deleted from the internal tracking system." "And the results of the independent test?" Dr. W reached into his envelope and removed a thin set of printed sheets, slid them across the table to the court clerk, who passed them to the judge and prosecutor. The judge scanned them in silence. "These are the results from 3 blood samples collected between December 12th and January 9th, he said. Each confirmed an elevated viral load with significant depletion of CD4 plus T cells. In all 3 cases, the pattern suggested late-stage immune suppression." He paused for a moment before adding, "The subject's body was no longer responding to basic immune triggers. Even minor infections would have been lethal without intervention." "Were any other individuals tested?" "Obtained 2 additional samples, one post-mortem from an inmate who shared the adjoining cell block, and one obtained from an external source, an independent sample marked by the initials JD. The prosecutor nodded. "Please explain what you found." All 3 samples revealed strikingly similar immunological profiles: high viral load, cytokine imbalance, secondary infection indicators. One of the samples contained additional RNA traces indicating shared exposure origin. The room felt like it had stopped breathing. "And did you identify the pathogen?" "I did not name it," Dr. W said carefully. "I do not have the clearance nor the authority to make definitive diagnoses outside of controlled lab conditions. What I will say is this. The profiles were consistent with advanced stage immunodeficiency, a viral suppression failure that had gone unaddressed for far too long. Doctor, in your opinion, were these transmissions accidental?" Dr. W didn't speak at first. He placed his hands flat on the witness stand. The prosecutor waited, and he said, "To the best of my knowledge, these transmissions were avoidable." Silence, the kind of silence that fills a room with lead. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't dramatic. He was methodical, almost cold, like a scientist reciting field notes, but it landed like a dropped brick. The judge glanced at the prosecution bench, then looked back at the defense. No one moved. No one objected. No cross-examination followed. Not yet. The defense attorney simply sat with his hands folded, expression unreadable. There was more testimony after that, more details, more descriptions of symptoms, of redacted memos, of logs erased or altered. He spoke about the anonymous technician who had refused to sign off on one of the lab reports, a woman who had called Dr. W late one night to say the chain of custody was broken, that someone had taken a sample without proper clearance and re-entered it under a different ID. He didn't know what happened to her after that. When he finished, the judge thanked him and dismissed the court for a private review session. No one stood. No one applauded. He gathered his files, placed them neatly into his folder, and walked off the stand without once turning to the gallery. The courtroom remained still. until the clerk collected the evidence samples. 3 tubes in sealed containers, each marked with the same classification. Do not open without level 4 clearance. Chapter 8, The Fallout. Mr. C sat on the same bench as before, the wood worn down under his weight, his coat unbuttoned even though the air inside the courthouse carried that dry chill that settled into bones. His eyes were still, unfocused, trained on nothing in particular. In his hands was the photograph, the same one he'd held the day he first agreed to testify, a faded print of his daughter, smiling against a backdrop of a cracked sidewalk in late summer light, before the illness hollowed her cheeks, before the world swallowed her name and spit it back out with shame and suspicion. He didn't smile, didn't blink much either. The day had passed like fog, his presence required only for a moment here or there, a signature, a silent nod, the kind of acknowledgement they needed on record to tie loose ends into clean knots. The judge had ordered the transcript sealed, no press, no official summary, no mention in any docket that could be traced publicly. What happened in that courtroom would remain in the shadows, bundled and buried beneath red tape and buried names. He watched people come and go through the hallway, suits, staff, strangers. None of them looked at him, not directly. He knew that was by design. He was a reminder of what they'd chosen to suppress. He'd said what he came to say, told them about the lab results, about her slow decay, about the names she never dared speak, but couldn't erase from her memory. He wasn't there for revenge. That time had passed. He was there for something quieter, crueler, to make sure they couldn't pretend they didn't know anymore. He placed the photograph gently back into his coat pocket and stood. He wouldn't return to that building again. He'd done his part. Somewhere across the city, deep inside the belly of MDC Brooklyn, the fluorescent lights in Block D buzzed over empty cells. The hallway smelled like fresh paint and bleach, though no one had painted anything. The block had been closed for repairs. A vague phrase circulated through memos with no further explanation. Staff weren't allowed down there unless they were part of facilities or restricted maintenance. Malik had already turned in his badge. They didn't fire him, they just reassigned him. No ceremony, no debriefing, no explanation. One day he was working overnight on Combs' cell, the next he was working records intake, a windowless corner with stacks of mislabeled files and a broken scanner that squealed when it warmed up. He didn't argue, didn't ask, but he noticed the way people looked at him now, eyes skimming over, voices lowering when he walked past. He wasn't one of them anymore. He was contaminated, not physically but by proximity. He'd seen too much. Known too much. No one said it, but they all felt it. He remembered that last night before Combs was moved. The cell was quiet, the man himself thinner than ever, face sunken into the bones beneath, skin pale and tight, like paper stretched too far. Malik had stood outside the door, watching through the slot as Combs muttered something in his sleep, twitching under a thin blanket. Then, just before shift change, he heard it. A voice, raspy and weak from the cell 2 doors down. A man who'd only arrived a few weeks prior. He was coughing and wet, and when Malik passed, he heard him say it. "Another one sick." He froze, turned slowly. The inmate didn't say anything else, just laid back and stared at the ceiling like he was counting the cracks that weren't there. Malik kept walking. He didn't log it, didn't mention it to the desk sergeant. He just clocked out, walked into the street, and never went back. In a small apartment 10 stories above a laundromat across the river, Dr. W sat at his desk, pen in hand, a half-empty cup of cold coffee by his elbow. The room was dim, shades drawn, only the glow of his desk lamp cutting through the haze of dust that drifted in the air like a silent snowfall. He hadn't written a medical note since the day he stepped off the witness stand. Not in the official system, not in any system. But that night, he opened his private logbook one final time. Final entry. Subject transferred without medical clearance. Block D declared under maintenance. No follow-up request received. All communications from MDC routed through legal review teams. No access to updated records. Surveillance blackout logs unreleased. As of last known vitals, subject exhibited signs of systemic failure, consistent with untreated viral progression. Immune collapse likely irreversible. Secondary exposure risk remains unquantified. 2 adjacent inmates relocated. 1 deceased. 1 under silent observation. No public advisory issued. Pathology lab confirmed matching strain markers in all 3 submitted samples. Technician anonymous. Results flagged undetermined origin. No official diagnosis entered. He paused, tapped the pen against the desk once, then continued. This was never about medicine. It was about silence. About delay. About the story they could still control if they moved fast enough. He was a liability not just because of what he did, but because of what he carried, because of what they let him carry. And if it spreads, it won't be on paper. It'll be on whispers. On death certificates that use soft phrases like failure and complications and unknown. I resign, effective immediately. I am not submitting this entry to any public health office. I am sending it to a private lab in Connecticut. They have no federal ties. If anything happens to me, they'll know where to look. He signed the page, dated it, tore it from the notebook with careful hands and placed it in an envelope along with 2 photographs of the lesions he had documented on Com's body. He sealed the envelope, placed 3 strips of tape over the flap, and scrawled the lab's address across the front. Then he slipped on a jacket and walked it down the block to a drop box. The cold air bit at his skin. He didn't mind. When the envelope slipped into the slot, he exhaled. He would never practice again. A week later, a low-ranking guard named Arturo posted a message on a private prison message board. An unofficial, anonymous place where corrections officers swapped stories, warnings, sometimes rumors too hot to say out loud. The message was short. Anyone else notice they cleared Block D without notice? Heard from someone in medical, a second guy died. Didn't match intake file, no record. They're calling it airborne anxiety now. Not joking. No one responded. But 2 days after that, the thread was gone. Archive. Nothing remained but a blank placeholder where the story used to be. In the weeks that followed, the case against Combs stalled. The legal team pivoted away from medical evidence. The survivors' statements were redacted, their testimonies postponed under sealed motions. Word spread that a settlement was being negotiated quietly, behind closed doors. Nothing official ever made it to the press. There were no statements, no press releases, no leaks. And outside the courthouse, Mr. C returned to his routine. Mornings at the construction yard, nights alone at his kitchen table. The photograph of his daughter placed inside a small wooden frame that leaned against the windowsill, the only light in the room when everything else turned dark. He didn't wait for justice anymore. He waited for peace. And deep inside the concrete labyrinth of MDC, the lights in Block D stayed off. No one asked why. No one filed a request to reopen it. The hallway remained quiet, the doors locked, the air still. But every now and then, late into the night, guards claimed they could hear something, a faint cough, a shuffle, the sound of something moving behind the walls. Truth isn't what we prove. It's what they're willing to silence.